Up next on the TWIP Network, Gordon Lang and I dive into the Canon G7X Mark II on All About the Gear. Hello, it's Doug Kay. I'm here once again with my good friend Gordon Lang from Brighton, England. How are you, Gordon?
I'm very good, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, and we are going to get into another one of the more confusingly named cameras. This is the Canon G7X Mark II. You know, I've got lots of questions. Why don't you just start by telling us what is the G7X Mark II and where does it, what is it?
Okay, here it is. Most obviously, the G7X Mark II is the Mark II version of the G7X. It's the successor to the original G7X, which was Canon's first foray into what has become an exploding market for 1-inch compacts. I'll tell you exactly what that means. It's a compact for enthusiasts. It's compact, so it's pocketable. It's for enthusiasts because it's got full manual control. It's got a pretty bright zoom lens on it. But most importantly of all, it's got a 1-inch sensor. Now, these sensors fall roughly in between those that you find in mobile phones and point-and-shoot cameras, and those that you find in interchangeable lens cameras like DSLRs and mirrorless. Falls in between there, so it offers a big upgrade in quality over a point-and-shoot or a phone, but without the bulk, without the weight and the size of an interchangeable lens camera. And it's hit a real sweet spot. Sony came up with this category. It's the Sony Sensor. They came up with this 1-inch 20-megapixel sensor, deployed it first of all in the RX100 series, then came out with a super zoom series, the RX10. Then Canon came along and went, you know what, we've noticed some really big sales here from Sony, so we're going to come out with our one, the original G7X. This is the Mark II version. Canon now has 4 different models, which have the 1-inch sensor, 5 if you include the old original G7X. And Panasonic came along and went, you know what, this would be great in our lineup too. So it now has a 1-inch sensor product. And of course, the Nikon One system uses a 1-inch sensor, and Nikon are going to be deploying their sensor, which is again 1-inch, in another line of compacts. So this market is exploding. There are so many choices, and as I said, they really hit a sweet spot in terms of control, quality, and pocketability. So in this show, not only are we going to talk about the features of the G7X Mark II, but crucially how it compares to the competition and which one's going to be best for you.
Okay, now this camera is part of Canon's PowerShot series, and there are some other PowerShot cameras as well. I used to have one, even more compact, maybe a lower end camera. Do you know what those are, like the 120, things like that?
Yeah, you've got to be careful because if you think that the naming of these is complex, you wait until you see what they're called across different regions in the world, because we have, you have in America on the lower end versions, in North America, you call them ELFs, we call them Ixus. I think in Japan they call them Pixies or something like that. There are as many different variations. But we have standardized, or rather Canon has standardized on the naming of its higher end models. The PowerShot G series are its models with the greater manual control, the bigger sensors, and the brighter lenses. And while the G7X, the original model, was obviously the first one that it brought out, the G7X Mark II now basically comes roughly in the middle of that range. There are smaller and lighter models with shorter lenses. There are bigger models with longer zooms or built-in EVF. So the G7X Mark II fits roughly in between. Should we go over the basic differences between the ones in the PowerShot G series?
I'm almost afraid to, but yes, let's do that now, get it out of the way, and then what we'll do is concentrate on just this camera. How does that sound?
Okay, that's cool. Now, there is a model called the G1X Mark II, I think. This is the elephant in the room, which we're going to ignore. Goodbye, elephant. Off you go. Nice camera, but it doesn't quite have many things in common with the other ones we're going to discuss. So ignore that camera, pretend it doesn't exist, and we're left with 4 models. The G9X, the G7X, and the Mark II version, the G5X, and the G3X. Okay, so they kind of go backwards. And Doug, I'm going to come to you for the prices of these. We're going to start off with the G9X. This is the smallest, the slimmest, the most pocketable. We reviewed it on All About the Gear, so check out that review in my review at cameralabs.com. Now, I should say before anything else, all 4 of these models have exactly the same 1-inch 20-megapixel sensor. They also all have touch-sensitive screens. They have that in common. Where they differ are their sizes, their lenses, and whether they have a viewfinder or not. So the G9X has a 3 times zoom. It's the smallest one. It's a fixed screen. It doesn't tilt. Doug, how much is the G9X?
It's approximately $450 US.
So this is the cheapest model from Canon with a 1-inch sensor. And it does, if you look at the prices of the competition, it's pretty much the cheapest current model with a 1-inch sensor. If you go back to Sony's original RX100 or RX100 Mark II, I have an RX100 Mark II right here. You may find them cheaper, but if you're after a new current model, the G9X is currently probably your cheapest compact with a 1-inch sensor. Next up comes the G7X and the Mark II version, which I hold here. I'm going to describe them both in common at the moment. It's a slightly bigger body. This allows the screen to tilt upwards. It also allows it to accommodate a bigger zoom lens. Rather than a 3 times, it is now a 4.2 times zoom, and it's pretty bright. So, Doug, give us the price of the original G7X and of the Mark II version, please.
I think the G7X is probably down to about $700 US. It's not much cheaper.
Right, I looked this up as well, just in case, because they are varying. The G7X Mark II is $699 US.
The Mark II, yes, right.
Yeah, now the Mark I version varies considerably in price, depending on when you check, depending on supply. Sometimes, if there's plenty of supply and the shops are trying to get rid of old stock, you can pick up a real bargain on it. But when I checked, when we recorded this show, there was actually only $50 difference between it and the Mark II version, in which case the too long didn't read or didn't watch version, buy the Mark II version. There's not a massive amount of improvements, but it's certainly $50 worth of improvements. So if you're only seeing $50 difference, get the new one. But if you're seeing $100 or $200 difference, the old one could be a good one to consider. Next up, the G5X. Again, reviewed it on All About the Gear. It actually shares the same 4.2 times zoom as the G7X, except it's in a chunkier body. It's got a bigger grip. It's got a fully articulated screen that doesn't just tilt vertically, it flips out from the side. But most importantly, it is the only model in Canon's range of these cameras with a built-in electronic viewfinder. All of the other models, you're composing with the screen alone. Do you have a price for the G5X?
I do have a price. It is $750, roughly US, $749 specifically. So again, there's that $50 question. Do you spend $50 and get the chunkier body with the EVF?
Crumbs, yes. Let's finish the review right now.
Well, wait, does it compromise the pocketability?
It does. It becomes a considerably less pocketable camera. The G7X and the RX100 series and the Lumix TZ100, ZS100, which we're also going to mention, will all just about squeeze in your pocket. It will become an unsightly bulge, but it will just about squeeze in, whereas the G5X definitely will not squeeze in unless we're talking about cargo pants or some sort of thing that MC Hammer might have worn back in the day. So, yeah, there is a pocketability question. Now, as always happens when we review new cameras, we're quoting a price of a product that is brand new. It's not been discounted yet. Whereas when we're comparing it to existing products, they've been out for, even if it's only been out for a couple of months, the prices have already begun to fall. So it's slightly unfair to look at this and say, well, obviously the G5X has got a lot more, $50 extra for a fully articulated screen and an electronic viewfinder. Why wouldn't you go for that? I mean, obviously. But I would expect over time that difference to become larger price-wise. But if you're shopping for it today, and that's the difference, $50, then, you look to the one with the greater features, right? And then finally, we've got the G3X. This is a considerably bigger body, although it doesn't have an EVF, but it does have a much bigger zoom. It's Canon Super Zoom model. It has a 25 times range. How much, Doug, is the G3X?
That one comes in at just about $900 US. And as you say, it's quite a different beast, really.
Yeah, completely different sort of thing. But as I said, what they all have in common is this 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor and touch sensitive screen. So, I mean, we can get that out of the way straight away. It's so nice to have a touch screen. And this is a key benefit that the Canon PowerShot G series has over Sony's RX100 series. We're on to the 4th generation from Sony now, still no touch screen on them. And for me, that repositioning of the AF area or the ability to pull focus during movies just by tapping a different part of the screen is so nice to have. And I miss it so much on those Sony models. Shall we discuss the Sony? We're going to discuss, I think, the Sonys later, because at the moment we've got so many features to juggle around. It'll be hard to keep them all in our heads. Is that okay? Let's
do that, yes. And we'll come back. We may touch on these others one more time. But yeah, let's dive in specifically to the G7X Mark II and just give us the tour. What is this thing all about in terms of lenses, controls, and so forth?
Okay, so externally, it looks fairly similar to the original G7X. There's one very obvious difference if you look at it from the front, and that is the presence of a grip. Not a huge grip, but a grip nonetheless, because on the original G7X, it just had a completely smooth front. There was a fashion for completely smooth front compacts for a while, and yeah, they kind of look clean and smart, but there's not a lot to get your hands around, really. And that's particularly inconvenient if you're filming video, because, I mean, when you're filming stills, if you don't get a good grip on it, you think, well, I'll just choose a faster shutter speed, and maybe I'll boost the ISO a bit so there's less chance of wobble. But when you're filming video, the secureness of the grip, the comfort of the grip is very important. So for the benefit of those watching the video, I will hold it up to the camera and show you a top view here. I'll just kind of angle this around. Hopefully, I'm going to put my very pale hand behind it so you can see that grip. It's not huge, but you can hold on to it much more comfortably than the old model. So that is the first thing to note. The next thing to note, and this is the next big feature, is there is a little switch to the corner of the lens ring. Now, all of these enthusiast class cameras have got a really nice feature. They all have a wheel on the around the lens barrel that you can configure as a control. So you could get it to control the aperture, but you could also reconfigure it to control the shutter speed or the ISO or the focal length or the manual focus. It's a really nice customizable wheel ring, but they all do it slightly differently. Now, Canon always had a clickable wheel, and I'll just show you that. So it goes around in steps. Actually, I'm going to put it next to my microphone, see if you can hear this.
Yes, we can.
So that's it clicking. Now, in contrast, Sony, with the RX100 series, has a completely smooth lens ring. I'm going to hold that to my microphone and turn it, and hopefully you won't hear anything. Silence. The sound of silence. That is the sound of a smooth ring. Now, there are pros and cons to both. Now, if you're shooting stills, clicks are really nice, because if you need to adjust the aperture or the ISO or the shutter speed by a stop, for example, and you know that the camera is set up to do it in third EV increments, you know you need 3 clicks. Click, 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 and you know you've moved a stop in exposure in one direction or the other. It's a very physical, I wouldn't describe it as visceral. There's feedback. You know, you can actually feel what's going on, and it allows you to make adjustments without actually checking the screen or confirming what you've got. I know that if I've turned it 3 clicks, that represents 1 stop of exposure. That's brilliant. And it's very frustrating on the Sony cameras because they're spinning freely. How much do I need to turn? How much of a turn is 3 clicks? I don't know. So you've always got to keep your eye on the screen or on the viewfinder, which, you know, means you haven't got your eye on the action or the composition or the lighting. So I prefer clickable rings when you're shooting stills. But when you're shooting video, they're terrible. Because if you want to adjust the exposure or the focus or any of those other things while you film, you don't want a control that goes click, 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 click. It's not smooth. It's very audible. And in fact, if the clicks are big, you can even wobble the camera a little bit. So the Sony one, the smooth ring, has the benefit for video. Canon's one, the clickable one, has the benefit for stills. So Doug, I put it to you, what is the first major upgrade the G7X Mark II has over its predecessor and its rivals too?
I'm going to guess it's the rotating ring around the lens that it can be either silent or click enabled.
Yeah. So at the moment, you heard it click. That's fine. I can just flick this switch on the front by the lens barrel, and now listen. Completely silent.
It's like two different cameras.
Yeah, I can declick it for video and click it back again for stills. It's a small feature, but a very, 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 very useful one. As I've explained the benefit for both of those. I mean, just as an example, I was filming with this camera today, the G7X Mark II, where I configured the front lens ring to adjust the aperture when I was filming video. And it allows you to go from, say, inside to outside, massive difference in brightness, and then you just turn the ring to adjust the exposure. You could, of course, do that before, but there'd be a load of clicking sounds. Now I can do it smoothly and quietly using the lens ring. So that is actually, I think, quite a considerable upgrade over the original G7X, and also a benefit that it has over the Sony RX100 series, which, just to remind you, are smooth. There is no click option. There's no feedback. Freaks me out. Now, Doug, you mentioned, actually, just before I move on, as I said, these are cameras aimed at enthusiasts. So just to kind of reconfirm that point, I'm going to hold the camera up to the camera on my laptop, and you can see that mode dial there. Now, this isn't unusual. All of these cameras of this class have them. You've got full exposure control there, program, aperture priority, shutter priority, full manual control, all the scene presets. So you've got a lot of control with these cameras. So that's what you've got on the top here, along with a nice exposure compensation dial underneath. Now, Doug, the feature that you mentioned, this is the next big physical feature. The previous G7X, the screen would flip out and keep going up, 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 until it actually faced the subject. This was brilliant for self-portraits and for filming pieces to camera. But it didn't tilt down, which wasn't useful if you were shooting high above the heads of crowds. And this was a benefit that Sony's RX100 3 and 4 had. You could angle it up to face you, but also down a bit to make it more comfortable to shoot over the heads of crowds. So Canon went, we've got to fix this. And now on the G7X Mark II, it also flips down. So you have that extra flexibility, whether you're shooting high or whether you're shooting at waist high, or whether you're filming pieces camera, which is great. So that, again, you might think, well, I don't know if that's a major feature, but to me, that's a very useful feature because I'm always shooting at unusual angles. However, I should mention again that the G7X Mark II, like its predecessor, does not have a built-in EVF. That's the major difference against the Sonys and the Panasonic that I'll come to later. Sticking on the physical side of the camera, again, little things that make a big difference. The USB port on the side can now accept charging. Now, we saw that on the other most recent PowerShot G series, but compared to the original G7X, you had to charge that battery in an external charger. Now, with the G7X Mark II, Canon generously supplies it with an external AC charger. So that's nice. It's the best of both worlds. You can charge it with the external charger, or you can charge it over USB. And I again did that only this morning. I was getting ready to go out. Normally I hit town in the afternoon and I prepare in the morning. And that includes recharging batteries and things. So I went out this morning, realized that the battery was almost flat on the G7X Mark II. And I thought, oh no, I've got to film some video with it. What am I going to do? Because I'm now on the move. It takes me about half an hour to walk from my house into Brighton town centre. So I simply took my Anker USB battery. This is a new one I've got, which supports quick charge. So it charges my phone very quickly. Sadly, not as far as I know. I don't know whether any of the USB ports in any of these cameras can deliberately suck more juice out of these things. I'd like to know, or would like to see some sort of quick charge certification on some cameras. But either way, within half an hour, by the time it took me to walk from my home to where I was going to shoot, it had gone from virtually flat to virtually full. What's not to like about that? I was nowhere near an AC point. You know, if it only charged over AC, I would have to have left half an hour later or an hour later. I would have to have charged it up before I could use it. So the fact that this camera can now be charged over USB is a huge benefit to me. And these are really nice portable batteries.
I think that alone is worth the $50 upgrade from the original G7X, because when I travel, the last thing I want to do is take a charger that's almost the size of the camera. You know, which they are. These cameras are so small that the charger really is substantial by comparison.
Exactly. Now, the next thing to note is invisible, which is the NFC. Now, the original model had NFC, but on Canon's most recent models, it's now dynamic NFC. And what that means is that the camera does not need to be switched on to be able to initiate a connection over NFC. So I've got a Samsung Galaxy S7, which has NFC. All I do is hold that phone against the camera. The phone doesn't need to have the app running. The camera doesn't need to be on. But as soon as they become sufficiently close enough for that NFC to kick in, they will communicate with each other, launch the app, and it's just seamless. So that makes the whole wireless experience much smoother.
Yeah, I think we Apple users can only imagine and dream what that must be like. We miss that so much. There's no, the iPhone has NFC, but Apple, I think, does not allow the application developers to access it for this purpose. For some reason, some political reason I can't understand.
I know, it's crazy. And I've had it now on several generations of Galaxy S phones. And it's just so nice to be able to touch the camera against the phone and have them communicate with each other. Sony does it really well because not only does it fire up the app, it kind of second guesses what you're going to do. If you're playing an image, it goes, Well, I bet they want to transfer that image, so it copies it across for you without you having to press a button. If you're actually in a shooting mode on the Sony and you touch them together, it automatically fires up the remote live view on the phone app. Again, it kind of guesses what you want to do and gets it right. To look at Canon's app, they now have a unified app called Camera Connect, which is the same app for the EOS DSLRs, presumably also their mirrorless cameras, and their PowerShot kind of fixed lens point and shoots. Same app, but bizarrely slightly different feature set depending on what you've got it connected to. And I don't see anyone talking about this, so I'm going to talk about it right now. The Camera Connect app, of course, lets you copy images from the camera to the phone. It also lets you copy movies from the camera to the phone, which not all of them do. It downsizes them to 720p if they started off at 1080, but it's still good quality, and they're good and ready to share straight on things like Instagram. I've already posted some videos from this camera on Instagram, including a time lapse I'll tell you about in a minute. But what you can't do when you've got it connected to this camera is trigger a movie recording remotely. You can copy one you've already made, but you can't trigger it remotely using the phone, which is a bit odd because most of them do let you do that, including when you connect the Canon app to one of its EOS DSLRs. Now, the last one I tested was the EOS 80D, and there it was. There was a menu option to remotely start movie recording, available for the EOS DSLRs, but not for the PowerShot compacts. That's a little bit odd, but there's one that's even odder. The third option on the list when you're in the app, when you've got it connected to one of these cameras, is location logging, which does what you'd think. It uses the GPS hardware or software, if it's doing it from the cell mass, in your smartphone to record a log of positions that can then be applied over Wi-Fi to the pictures in the camera. Great. So they're now tagged with their location. So far, so good. Connect the same phone running the same app to an EOS DSLR, and that option disappears. Location logging is no longer available. So you think, did I imagine it? So then you reconnect it back to the PowerShot, and it pops up again. It literally appears. Connect it back to the EOS DSLR, and it disappears. Is this a cynical way for Canon to push sales for its GPS receiver for EOS DSLRs? I wonder. I've asked them many times. They won't confirm, but I think that's mean. What do you think? It's tight, isn't it? The feature's there, and they switch it off.
It is, and it's this whole idea of changing features for the price and so forth. I think everybody should make all their cameras have all the features at the lowest price, and that would just make life simpler for everybody.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that's a little rant of mine. So I'm glad we got it out of the way. I feel a little better now.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I have not experienced that specific thing, but it is frustrating when you know that the app and the app and the camera have this capability and it's simply disabled.
Yeah. So moving on, though, the G7X Mark II is one of Canon's first compacts to feature its latest Digic 7 processor. Now, it's always very interesting when a new version of the Digic processor comes along because it's like you've invited one of those home removal or improvement TV shows around to your house. They keep the same things, they move them around, they add a few things, they take away a few things. Some of the things you liked, some are unexpected. And it's the same with the image processor. So Digic 7, of course, shuffles things around in the menus, often for no apparent reason. I'm sure there's a master plan involved. One of the stranger things I noticed that Canon does, it always seems to change its mind on where it should put the scene presets and the creative effects. So by the scene presets, I mean things like portrait, sports, macro, that sort of thing. By creative effects, I mean things like the color modes, the miniature mode, the fisheye simulation, the HDR presets, things like that. Now, on previous models, they were on two different positions on the mode dial. Now they're on the same one, on the scene position on the dial. That's where you'll find all of the scene presets, and then suddenly all of the special effects are there. And then there's a couple more scene presets. It's like they've gone, just stick it all under the carpet here. Let's stick it all together. It'll be fine. No one will notice. So that's slightly odd. But the big new feature from Digic 7 is that the camera will now do time-lapse movies. These are accessed within the movie menu. You can go for auto movies, you can go for manual exposure movies, which works really well. And there's an hour time-lapse movie option with some presets, which are set up for things like, are you going to be doing a time-lapse of people walking along? Are you going to be doing a time lapse of clouds, say a sunset? And it will change the interval and the total recording time, that sort of thing, for kind of typical settings for those environments. But fortunately, if you are an enthusiast, you can then go in and adjust those. So I've filmed time-lapse movies of people and time-lapse movies of the sky, and hopefully we can show you some of those on this video.
You are probably looking at one right now. At this very moment, we are showing you, if you're watching the video, one of Gordon's sample time-lapse videos.
Now, one of the other things to mention about Digic 7 is it obviously, at its core, is processing the raw data into JPEGs. Oh, and in fact, that reminds me that it now supports raw processing in camera. So if you shoot a raw file, you can now, in playback, edit that raw file. You can apply any of the color effects. You can, change things like the white balance. And it's really nice to have raw processing in camera. Now, as you know, I don't like doing a lot of processing outside of the camera, but I'm not averse to doing it inside of the camera. So, if I've taken a picture in color and I've thought, you know what, that would look really nice in black and white, and I know it's got a nice black and white mode on there, then I can just process the raw file in camera in playback and do that. But Canon also, with each generation of Digic, it kind of tweaks the way it processes the data for the in-camera JPEGs. And to me, the image quality actually looks a bit nicer than before. It's quite hard to quantify. The pictures are kind of more vibrant and attractive without looking overcooked. It's like the ideal scenario where it's like saltier food in a way. There's kind of more flavor to them without spoiling the effect. So I think, and I would invite anyone who's interested in buying this camera to check out my sample images page at Camera Labs, or of course look at the ones we've got on the All About the Gear page. Have a look at pictures from the new model and pictures from the old model, because I've taken lots of similar shots in similar places at similar times of day. Check them out and see what you think. To me, the Mark II JPEGs do look a little bit nicer than before.
So one thing to clarify here, when you edit a RAW file, do you then save that as a new JPEG? Is that what happens? Or do you somehow modify the RAW file?
No, it's the same with all cameras that offer in-camera RAW processing. You kind of access it in playback, and it creates a new JPEG, which has a new number as well. So it's not associated with the old one, because, of course, you might have shot RAW plus JPEG, so it can't overwrite the JPEG you did with it. It creates a brand new JPEG with the settings that you specified. Different cameras offer different amounts of control. Some of them let you change the noise reduction, the aspect ratio, even the quality, the amount of compression, that sort of thing. But at a bare minimum, you get to control the white balance and the effects. And just those two really let you change the mood of a picture. And I really appreciate the ability to do that.
So time-lapse is a good segue into the question about video. How does the G7X Mark II, I have to look at my notes every time I want to remember what this is called. The G7X Mark II, how does it do on video?
Okay, so it will do 1080p at 24, 25, 30, 50, or 60p. Now, all those frame rates are available regardless of where you buy the camera. Like other Canon models, you unlock either one set or the other set depending on whether you've set the video mode to PAL or NTSC. So if you set it to PAL, where I am in the United Kingdom, you would see the frame rates as 25 and 50. If you set it to NTSC, which you can do, then you will see those frame rates disappear and 24 and 60 appear. So there is no higher frame rate for 1080p than 60, which means you're limited in terms of slow motion. I did, just out of interest, and hopefully if Doug's feeling very ambitious, he may overlay a clip right now. If he doesn't, it's available at Camera Labs, where I shot some seagulls in Brighton and also the waves of the sea at 60p and put it on a 24p timeline. So that's going to slow it down by 2.5 times, roughly. So that's... Well, as you know, it's not a massive slowdown, is it? It's not like shooting at 120 frames per second or anything like that, which, lest we forget, is something that is possible on the RX100 Mark IV, or even at high frame rates if you're willing to reduce the quality. At this point, we should also say that Canon still has not deployed 4K on any of these models. So again, that's a feature that it lacks compared to, say, the Lumix TZ100 or ZS100 or Sony's RX100 Mark IV. Again, those models have 4K video. So if you want 4K video with a 1-inch form factor, You're not going to get it from Canon quite yet, which is a shame because, remember, they are all using the same sensor or roughly the same generate. Sometimes there's a slight generational difference, but it's still a Sony 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor. We know what it's capable of. Canon are choosing not to take 4K video from it, or maybe the Digic 7 that's inside here, maybe it can't do it. Who knows? Either way, it doesn't offer it.
Before we wrap up the video, for video and stills, does this camera offer any image stabilization?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that question, Doug. It does offer image, so it's got optical stabilization in the lens, and it also has additional electronic stabilization that you can deploy for video. Now, you've got to be careful with electronic stabilization because what it does is it effectively crops the image a bit so that it has a border of pixels around the edge. Now, if you imagine that central frame moving around, wobbling around, so long as it stays within the outer frame, then technically you could stabilize it by borrowing pixels from around it and basically recreating the image, rotating it or de-skewing it as you go along. And they do amazingly have the processing power to do this. And it does produce a really stable looking result, but you do lose slight field of view because of the crop. And you do lose some resolution as well because you're doing a lot of pixel wrangling. So if you're, you might see some more moire, but if you're shooting handheld and you're walking, for example, then it can work really well. And again, today I was shooting with the G7X Mark II. I did a lot of shooting today, actually, with it. And I was walking through the lanes of Brighton with everything turned on. So I had dynamic image stabilization turned to its high level. I also had the auto leveling, which attempts to keep the horizon straight, enabled. And it's slightly, I use the word nauseating. As you walk along, there's a kind of funny up and down, but it is quite smooth. The shake isn't like this. It's kind of like a gentle swaying as I walk along. And I was walking pretty quickly through these paths, and it did a pretty good job at stabilizing them. So you can switch all of that technology on if you are going to walk with the camera. Do your old Martin Scorsese Goodfellas scene where you follow somebody down into the basement kitchen area and up into the, hey, how are you doing? That sort of long Steadicam shot. But I would say if you're after the best quality, you want to switch a lot of that technology off and just go for the basic optical stabilization when you're shooting, tripod or more careful handheld stuff. And I should say, because I don't think we've actually so far mentioned the specific specifications of the lens, because this is really critical. It's a 4.2 times zoom, equivalent to 24 to 100 millimeters. So it takes you from quite wide to, a reasonable kind of portrait length. And it's quite a fast lens as well. It's f1.8 when it's at 24 mil, and it's at f2.8 when it's at 100 mil. So it doesn't slow down too much at the long end. And at the short end, it'll focus as close as 5 centimeters, which gives you some really nice macro opportunities.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition also into talking. I think we're pretty well wrapped up with this camera. We can maybe compare it now in a little more detail to the Sony RX100s and the Lumix ZS100 or ZS100.
Definitely.
Just on the lens thing, I've got my little RX100 Mark IV here, and I'm looking at the front of it, and it too is f1.8 to f2.8. So it has the same shift in widest aperture as you zoom. The only difference is that the Canon goes a little bit longer in focal length, goes up to the equivalent of 100 millimeter versus the Sony, which is 24 to 70. So slightly longer lens there, going to 100 millimeter instead of 70.
Slightly. 50%, mate. 50% longer.
Almost. 105 would be 50%.
Yeah. Close. It's close.
If we're being picky.
Well, I am being picky because that is one of the major differences that you would want to weigh up. And I've done some comparisons with this, and you do, particularly when you're shooting portraits, you can achieve a slightly shallower depth of field when you're shooting with the Canon G7X Mark I and II versus the Sony RX100 III or IV. Because 70 millimeter at 2.8, this is all equivalent because, of course, it's all a lot smaller than that, versus 100 mil at 2.8, you are going to get a slightly different effect. And I've got an example of that in my reviews of these cameras. So it's better for that. That longer range I do find useful. But remember, they're all starting off with 20 megapixels, so you can crop it and still end up with quite a few pixels to work with. It's not like we're dealing with a 10 megapixel camera here. There is plenty of pixels, plenty of latitude for cropping. So one of the major differences, like we say, between the G7X Mark II and the RX100 III is the zoom range. 24 to 70 on the Sony versus 24 to 100 on the Canon. Another major difference is that the Canon screen is touch sensitive, whereas the Sony is not. But then, so far you're thinking, hey, the Canon, it's got a touch screen, it's got a longer zoom. These are big benefits. But then there's the big feature of the Sony RX100 III, which is the built-in electronic viewfinder. And it's not like just a little rubbish little one. It's actually really good. I mean, how often do you use the one on your Mark IV, Doug?
I use it fairly often, less and less perhaps because I'm finally adjusting to using a rear LCD, but we'll take a little look at it here. You can see that on the Sony, if you push the little button, then the viewfinder pops up and then you pull it out. You have to actually pull it out slightly, otherwise it'll be totally out of focus. So it's very handy, and the camera does a very good job of using that also as a way to turn the camera on and off if you desire. But yeah, that is one of the big differences between the cameras. But I'm going to put you on the spot, Gordon. How about image quality? Do you have any sense of the difference in image quality between the RX100 series and the G7X Mark II?
Yeah, I do. I think Canon's image processing, especially on Digic 7, is slightly more natural looking to me than the Sony's. Now, there's not a lot in it, but I do personally prefer the JPEGs out of camera from the Canon, especially the G7X Mark II, than I do from the RX100 3 or 4. But of course, you can tweak the JPEG engine in the Sony's, or you can shoot RAW and adjust it to your heart's content. It's subtle. It is subtle, but if you do put me on the spot, which you did, I prefer the image quality out of the Canon, but I'm not in any way complaining about the image quality from the Sony. I own an RX100 Mark II, and I'd be very happy to upgrade that to a Mark III or 4, for that electronic viewfinder. But really, let's just say I'm being very picky here in that they deliver essentially the same image quality. What you're looking at, the difference between these cameras, because the RX100 Mark III, if I'm correct, is about $799.
That's correct.
So it's $100 more than the brand new price for the G7X Mark II. So we would expect the G7X Mark II to maybe go down a little bit, so that gap will broaden. But right now that we made this video, $100 difference, that gets you an electronic viewfinder on the Sony, but on the Canon, it gets you a touch screen and a slightly longer zoom.
Right. And the Mark IV is up there at $950 US. So this is a $250 premium. And I would generally say it's not worth it. I don't know. I bought it. Don't ask me why. It's a whole other story. But I'm not sure that I could make a good case for why someone would spend $250 more for this camera versus the G7X Mark II.
Well, I mean, obviously what the RX100 Mark IV gives you over the 3, because it's the same body, same lens, is that it will shoot 4K video, and it will shoot a variety of slow motion modes. It does 1080p at quite respectable slow motion frame rate, and then it begins to reduce the quality to offer 240, 480, and 960 frames per second. 960 frames per second. I mean, the quality, the frame resolution is reduced considerably, but this is the sort of frame rate you needed a Phantom camera for, the ones that they use at sporting events and for scientific purposes. These are not cheap cameras. And Sony has now not only got it under $1,000, but in something that will fit in your pocket. So yes, the RX100 IV is expensive compared to its rivals, but look what it can do. And if you are going to be able to exploit those slow motion capabilities, buy it. If not, you've got to ask yourself the 4K question. And that brings us to our next alternative, and this one is particularly compelling. This is the Panasonic Lumix. In North America, they call it the ZS100. In the rest of the world, they call it the TZ100. It's the same camera, just a different name. Again, it's that same 1-inch 20-megapixel sensor, but what Panasonic have done is equip it with a significantly different lens. Now, the Sonys were 24 to 70. The Canon was 24 to 100. Well, the Lumix starts at 25, so it's 1 millimeter less wide, but it's a 10 times zoom. It's not a 3 and a bit times or a 4 and a bit times. It's a 10 times zoom. The long end is 250 millimeter, and it manages to pack that into a body that is really essentially about the same size. It's only a couple of millimeters bigger. It's still pocketable. Right, and it also has an electronic viewfinder built in. Interestingly, what it does, I don't have it here, but I will demonstrate with my finger, that in the top left corner of the screen, in the top left corner, that's where Panasonic actually has its viewfinder permanently visible. So to use it, you just literally hold it up to your eye and it switches over. Compare that to the Sony. It achieves a slightly smaller form factor by having a retractable EVF, but you need to pull it out. And that slows you down by a couple of seconds. You know, you've got to pull it out and then pull it forward towards you in that two-step process Doug demonstrated, whereas on the Panasonic, it's there all the time. The image is slightly smaller, but it's there all the time. So you get the 10 times zoom, you get the built-in viewfinder. The screen is also touch-sensitive. It doesn't tilt. Otherwise, it would have everything. But here's the icing on the cake. Because it's a Panasonic, it, of course, does 4K video. And because it's a Panasonic, they can exploit it in all those clever photo grabbing opportunities. You know, you can grab photos in camera from 4K video. You can adjust the focus after the event on 4K video. You can do all these clever tricks with it. And here's the kicker. Here's the killer, right? The ZS100, TZ100. Doug, how much does it cost?
It is only $700, making it the same price as the G7X Mark II. So we've added an incredible zoom range. We've added 4K video. We've added an electronic viewfinder. My guess is that you're paying some price in terms of image quality with a 10x zoom, but you're getting all that for the same price of the camera we're talking about today.
And it has a touch screen as well. What it doesn't have is an articulated screen. And the lens is inevitably optically slower. Now, we were discussing the Sonys and the Canon, which are f1.8 to 2.8. Well, the Lumix starts at f2.8 and ends somewhat slow. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's something like f5.6, around that kind of ballpark. So it starts off more than a stop slower and ends way more than a stop slower. What that in turn means is that it's capturing less light. It's letting less light to the sensor. So under the same conditions, it's going to have to deploy higher ISOs, typically a stop higher at the wide angle end. What it's also going to do is not be able to achieve a shallow depth of field effect. What you'll need to do, if you want to blur the background at all on that Lumix ZS100, TZ100, you'll need to zoom it into its maximum focal length and step back a lot. If you're shooting a portrait, you'd be yelling at someone. If you're shooting portraits at 250mm, smile over there, smile. No, look discreet, look mysterious. Give me your catalog pose. And they'll be like, what? What are you saying? And so you get a lot of pictures with a nice flattened perspective and shallow depth of field, but everyone's going, what? In your pictures? What? I can't hear you. You get closer to a more typical portrait focal length of, say, 70 to 100mm. And yeah, you're more connected with your subject, but you're shooting at... You know, you're shooting at maybe f4 compared to f2.8 on the Canon and the Sony, and you do see that. You do see that difference in the blurring of the background. Now, I should say that none of these will massively blur the background. You know, this is not an interchangeable lens camera with a bigger sensor and a very bright lens. This is still a smaller sensor. So the amount of blurring is not significant. But the fact is the Lumix has less of it than the Canon and the Sony. But look what you get for the same price. 4K video, built-in electronic viewfinder, and a 10 times zoom in much the same form factor.
Yeah, and I had a chance to shoot with the ZS100 myself. I really like that camera, and it's one because of the number of features that are packed in at that $700 price that I have recommended to a number of people. I've recommended the RX100s to people, but the ZS100 is a really sweet camera for what you get for that price. So Gordon, to wrap this up, how would you help people decide which of the GX cameras to buy? Let's just summarize very quickly, again, the deltas, the difference between those, because that is still the most confusing thing. One more time.
Yeah, it becomes quite easy if you just want to shop within Canon's own range. So let's say you've decided you want a compact with lots of control and this larger 1-inch sensor for the better quality. So you've got these 4 models to choose from. First thing you should ask yourself is, does it have to be as small as possible? Does it have to be smaller than what I'm holding here? If it does, you get the G9X. It's easy because that one is driven by size alone. Next thing you need to ask yourself is, okay, do I want an electronic viewfinder? If you do, it's easy because there's only one in the range which has it. That's the G5X. Job done. Also gives you the fully articulated screen, which is really nice and a bigger grip to hold on to. Next question you need to ask yourself, are you satisfied with a 4.2 times zoom? Because that's what you'll find on the G5X and the G7X Marks 1 and 2. If you're not, you want something longer, then you're going to have to go really long and you go for the G3X, which of course has that 25 times range, absolutely massive super zoom range. And then what that leaves you with is the kind of all-rounder, the general purpose model, which is the G7X Mark I and, of course, the new Mark II. This is your general purpose model. It gives you an articulated screen, which you don't get on the smallest one, but yet, while it doesn't have the reach of the G3X, it is going to still fit in your pocket. And it doesn't have the electronic viewfinder of the G5, but they're the kind of features that you've got to weigh up. So I would do it on size, lens range, and whether you need the electronic viewfinder or not.
Okay. And then if you decide you really need 4K video, you've got to leave the Canon line. You go to either the ZS100 or the RX100 from Sony, and the big difference there is primarily the lenses and the price. You get the 10x zoom on the ZS100, but you get the faster glass on the RX100 for a bit of a premium.
It's, again, almost 50%. It's that 50% figure again, except when you're talking cash, we're talking about this between $700 and almost $1,000. That's a significant chunk of change, as they say. In fact, it's almost enough to buy the ZS100 and a Canon G9X, which you could give to your friend or your partner. I mean, you've got to really think that Sony is really high priced. So, and it's kind of a shame in a way, because a lot of what you're paying for on the RX100 Mark IV are the slow motion capabilities. And I can imagine a lot of people wanting the RX100 Mark IV for the 4K video, not being that bothered about the slow motion, but still having to pay this high premium. And that's where Panasonic has ducked in underneath with a product that's significantly cheaper, but still delivers 4K. And actually, it does fairly respectable slow motion as well, just not quite as dramatically slow as the Sony offers. And again, there's still the RX100 Mark III, which is obviously the biggest rival for the G7X Mark II for me. And there it boils down to, do you want the touch screen and the slightly longer zoom of the Canon, or are you willing to sacrifice those for the built-in EVF and the slightly higher price of the Sony? Otherwise, it's
and the 4K video.
No, because the RX100 III doesn't have 4K.
Oh, the
video.
Mark III. Yes, you're right. You're right.
Yeah. So they're the ones you weigh up: the touch screen and the slightly longer range, and of course the choice between clicking and declicking on the lens ring, versus the viewfinder and the slightly higher price of the Sony. That's the RX100 Mark III versus the G7X Mark II. To me, they're the two that most people will be really wondering, really weighing up. And I'm surprised that, given the RX100 III is, over a year old, that Sony isn't discounting it more. Maybe it will, particularly if the G7X Mark II begins to fall in price. Because the G7X, the original G7X, when there was plenty of supply out there, it very quickly became the most affordable enthusiast compact with a 1-inch sensor. Now, because supply is drying up, the prices artificially increase again, so there's not a lot of difference. But this model could, like the G9X, find itself at a very keen price point. So when you're weighing up these features, do keep your eye on the prices all the time, because they change, and suddenly one model could become significantly more compelling than another.
Very good. Well, Gordon, thank you very much for the time that you've spent with me here looking at let me look it up again, the G7X Mark II from Canon. A very nice camera in sort of the mid-range, although because of the feature matrix, it's hard to say the mid-range, because it changes quite a bit from one model to the next. So thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching and listening. And a reminder that if you're interested in purchasing a G7X Mark II, or any other camera that we review here on All About the Gear, please head on over to cameralabs.com. Read Gordon's in-depth, detailed everything that you wanted to know about and more about these cameras, and click on the Buy Now links. Thank you very much, Gordon. We'll see you next time.
See you, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.